Okay, we are back and we start part 4 of How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. Part 4 is labeled The Ultimate Goals of Reading. We are on chapter 20 and it is titled The Fourth Level of Reading, Syntopical Reading. So far, the summaries have revolved around the reading of books in isolation, right? In other words, we're treating each book as one entity to be analyzed. However, most profound inquiries require the reading of more than one book, and there's also the challenge of deciding which of these to read. Alrighty, so one way to overcome this is to try and limit the subject you're interested in or asked to research about. Okay, so love, for instance, is far too broad, but, I quote, fiction writing on love from one man to another in 16th century British literature does not seem so arduous a task anymore. Okay, make no mistake though, this is still challenging work if you were to choose such a topic. Quite often, you can only truly understand whether two or more works are related only after you have read them and not before. So back to our example of 16th century British literature. Even such a limited topic will likely yield a vast array of texts. So this is where the second level of reading comes into use. Recall that first, you should skim a book and then read it superficially. Give that no more than an hour. By doing that, you'll have an understanding, albeit a shallow one, of the contents of the books. And you will also have cut down your bibliography to a more manageable size. Remember that, as mentioned in a previous chapter, one of the pillars of successful reading is knowing what to read at what speed. Time is often wasted on texts that do not require careful reading, while not enough time is given to worthy books or worthy sections of those books. When classifying, it is important to not only identify what kind of book it is, but whether it might potentially be useful in the future or not. Only practice and experience can help here, as each person's project, interests, research parameters, you name it, everyone's situation is different. Okay, you should also avoid multitasking. Okay, this is an important point here. One common mistake is to try and blend the second and third stages of reading by attempting to analyze everything you're inspecting. Okay, aim for quality rather than quantity and avoid haste by breaking tasks down and tackling them accordingly. Okay, as I said before in one of the earlier videos, our brains are not designed for multitasking. Okay, so if you're trying to read, understand, and analyze at the same time, you're bound to do none of these well. Okay, there are 5 steps to syntopical reading. Let's start. Step 1. Find relevant passages. The whole book will not be relevant to the question you are seeking. You must therefore identify passages that suit your purposes. Try not to cut corners and do this step at the same time you're shortlisting the books. Do not do that, okay? One thing at a time. Remember that in syntopical reading, you're making connections, so the author's original aim of the book may not necessarily help. I quote, "When you read a book analytically, you put yourself in a relation to it of disciple to master. When you read syntopically, you must be the master of the situation." Page 318. Step 2. Bringing the authors to terms. This step is perhaps the most challenging. Okay? Recall that in analytical reading, you must come to terms with an author. But when you read syntopically, it is unlikely that all authors use all terms uniformly. It is you, therefore, who must establish your terms and place the author's ideas under those umbrellas. The different authors may not have had your device problem in mind. Okay? More often than not, they won't, right? Otherwise, what's the point of you writing about it? And so it is up to you to make sense of multiple texts. Step 3. Get the questions clear. We're not only defining terms here, but establishing propositions as well. To that end, a clear set of questions ought to be put in place, where each is answered by one or more of the authors being read. The challenge here is to make these questions answerable by all authors, but since they may not originally have had part or all of them in mind, right? So part of those questions or all of those questions in mind, it is no easy task. Sometimes an author may have nothing explicit to say. In this case, we must, with caution, attempt to infer what he or she would have said. The order of the questions will vary based on subject, but a general guideline can be established. Typically, one starts with, and I quote, the existence or character of the phenomenon or idea we are investigating, page 320. The next set of questions deals with, I quote, how the phenomenon is known or how the idea manifests itself, page 320. Finally, one often explores, and I quote, the consequences of the answers to the previous questions, page 320. Step 4. Defining the issues. Rarely is an issue worth investigating simple, i.e., it seldom has two clear-cut opposing answers. Given that there are usually several types of answers when one is examining a topic syntopically, it is up to the reader to group them in a way that makes sense. To further complicate matters, authors may not only have varying views, but varying conceptions altogether. Here, it is an issue not of opposition, but of a different understanding or approach altogether. The reader needs to frame the question in such a way that it encompasses all views appropriately. Step 5. Analyzing the discussion. The first 4 steps help us answer the previously established questions. What does the book say? And how does it say it? Step 5 aids us in coming up with answers to the questions, is it true? And what of it? The task of a syntopical reader is not necessarily to find a definitive answer. In fact, doing so for most issues is virtually impossible. Instead, one must look for a new perspective on a topic, one that combines all opposing viewpoints, each with their own merits. This new truth, then, consists of structuring relevant assertions, not haphazardly, but in an ordered manner that can be justified. In essence, one is elucidating the dimensions of a problem in the hope that someone, perhaps, but not necessarily the writer him or herself, may make sense of one day. So, and the 5 steps. Note that disagreement does not always need to be present for intellectual discussion to take place. Rarely is an author fully in one camp or the other. Typically, several authors you have shortlisted will hold many opposing viewpoints. A truth may be divided into many truths. Each opinion may hold a portion of the truth and may not be fully correct all the time and in all situations. Sometimes, all current opinions may be false, awaiting a new opinion to emerge, one that is closer to the answer. The job of the syntopical reader, as mentioned, is not to discover the truth, right? But to bring together several pertinent opinions and organize them in a way that makes sense. He or she, and I quote, tries to look at all sides and to take no sides. Page 324. No person will succeed in being fully objective, but it is an ideal that one must strive for nonetheless. By the way, bias need not be explicit judgment, but can manifest itself, and I quote, in a variety of subtle ways, by the manner in which arguments are summarized, by shades of emphasis and neglect, by the tone of a question or the color of a passing remark, and by the order in which the various different answers to key questions are presented. Pages 324 to 325. One useful tool here is to refer back to textual evidence, to present readers with the author's own language in a way that is fair, i.e. not taken out of context. For an example of syntopical reading, if you get the book, see pages 325 to 329, or if you already have it. All right, let's move on. Syntopical reading involves a paradox. I quote, unless you know what books to read, you cannot read syntopically. But unless you can read syntopically, you do not know what to read. Page 329. You might think that asking a person who knows about the field you wish to inquire about might be the solution. But, more often than not, such a person will not only tell you what to read, but how to read it. And that's the dangerous bit. In other words, this person will color your perception of the topic, limiting your scope and your thinking even before you've begun your research. The author suggests consulting the Syntopicon, a then revolutionary accomplishment that aim to be for ideas what dictionaries are for words. And if you recall, or if you read, or sorry, if you watched my overview, I talked about that. I really feel for Adler. He spent 10 years and like $10 million, I don't know, working on this. Unfortunately, and despite a 1990 revision, the Syntopicon has fallen into obscurity. Reasons cited were the assumptions of Adler and others that logic and only logic is needed for understanding a book. And the fact that only content is important, that form, should be discarded. Furthermore, the work was unabashedly biased toward Western writings. In fact, biased may be an understatement, as the works included in the Syntopicon were exclusively written by Western writers, right? I should point out that the authors anticipated many of these contentions and others and provided counter-arguments to them on pages 333 to 335. In retrospect, of course, we know that these have sadly been in vain, right? Yeah, and again, I say sadly because Adler, who spearheaded the project, and his team spent over a decade compiling the Syntopicon, and it must have been crushing for him to see his efforts come to nothing. That having been said, and despite the overall failure of the Syntopicon, we, the people living today, have tools and resources available to us that were the stuff of dreams as recently as 2 or 3 decades ago. Okay, we now have Google Books, the Google search engine, online forums, useful websites, online databases, you name it, right? So in this day and age, there's really no excuse. There's really no excuse not to amass different texts on similar topics. Okay, regardless of the Syntopicon's reception, being able to compare and contrast 2 or more related texts, to organize them and make sense of their essence is vital to becoming an independent thinker. Below is a summary I've taken from pages 335 to 336 of what was discussed in this chapter, which has admittedly been difficult to summarize. Okay, we start. I start my quoting from pages 335 to 336. 1. Create a tentative bibliography of your subject by recourse to library catalogs, advisors, and bibliographies in books. 2. Inspect all of the books on the tentative bibliography to ascertain which are germane to your subject and also to acquire a clearer idea of the subject. 3. Inspect the books already identified as relevant to your subject in order to find the most relevant passages. 4. Bring the authors to terms by constructing a neutral terminology of the subject that all or the great majority of the authors can be interpreted as employing, whether they actually employ the words or not. 5. Establish a set of neutral propositions for all of the authors by framing a set of questions to which all or most of the authors can be interpreted as giving answers, whether they actually treat the questions explicitly or not. 6. Define the issues, both major and minor ones, by ranging the opposing answers of authors to the various questions on one side of an issue or another. You should remember that an issue does not always exist explicitly between or among authors, but that it sometimes has to be constructed by interpretation of the author's views on matters that may not have been their primary concern. 7. Analyze the discussion by ordering the questions and issues in such a way as to throw maximum light on the subject. More general issues should precede less general ones, and relations among issues should be clearly indicated. That is it. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.